Hello again. This is Dr. Cole with Sport and Exercise Psychology, Kin 359 during summer. And I am putting together Unit 2 Screencast. And this unit will cover competition, cooperation, feedback, and a little bit of communication leadership. You'll notice that we start out again very similarly to what we have in the past as far as having our study guide slide. And for this section in particular, and for the rest of the course, it's important that we talk about competition and cooperation and the differences between the two and understanding the roles that both of them play in our performance. Specifically, competition is this social process with a comparison. What I haven't done is put that word in bold in there, but competition is a social process of comparison when we look at our performance. And again, performance can be performance or performance or performance. In that, performance can be on the soccer field, it can be in the weight room, it can be out walking the dog, it can be in the boardroom with doing shares in exchange, or as a lawyer or judge or a military officer. Performance is performance is performance. And so competition is that competitive process that involves social comparison. The difference to that, or the different concept to that, is the idea of cooperation, which is a social process that's self-evaluated, very much in line with task mastery and that task goal orientation from our last unit, because it does not, you'll notice it's absent, does not involve a social process, or a comparison piece. And that's an important piece to keep in mind. In addition to distinguishing between those two, we need to understand competition as a process that comes with essentially four bases, if you will, that spins around a playing field of who we are and our motives and abilities and our attitudes. Every situation we enter into can have an objective competitive piece to it. So as a swimmer swimming against the clock, a runner running against the clock, those are objective competitive environments. We know in basketball, for example, that time runs out and then the game is over. So that's where it's competitive. You know who wins or loses at the end of the game. Compare that against a subjective competitive situation, which is how well am I performing? How do I accept or how do I appraise my performance? We talked about this previously with those individuals who seek out failure or seek out success or seek out challenges, seek out evaluative settings. So this is a subjective competition, and that's composed partly of who we are and our innate competitiveness. We have a response once we enter a competitive process, which is an important piece that's influenced by both who we are and where we are. This is certainly one of my favorite slides with the cheerleader on the left who continues, despite her injuries, to do her competitive routine. And then on the right we have two of golf's greatest performers that we'll probably ever see. Certainly fierce competitors, at least Tiger was in his day, not so much recently. But at the same time, instead of competing against one another, and the woman, Annika Sorenstam, is certainly a competitive golfer who could compete with the men and did on the men's tour briefly. But they've put aside their competitive focuses to work together in a collaborative process. So every situation they get into here, what they've done, their response has become collaboration versus just sheer competition. And I think that's an important thing to think about as we go through here. As it's a process, we have a product, or what we call consequences. Usually there's an evaluation, whether it's a personal evaluation or a social evaluation. You can see the football player's not very happy here, whereas the women's soccer players are. And so besides understanding competition as a process, what we've done from a real fundamental research standpoint is look at what are the influences on competition and cooperation, and how do we go about doing that. Triplet cyclist is a fantastic, very simple study in putting two groups of cyclists both in a room that's completely barren and measuring how much work they do on the bike. all given the same instructions. The only difference is one group had truly a completely empty room, except for themselves, whereas the second group had a empty room save for a time clock that just showed the present time, and it did have a second hand on it. And what Triplet found was just by having that clock in the room, that small little adjustment, that group did significantly more work than the group that didn't have a clock. And so the inference there is that we're constantly trying to compete, and that we naturally compete against anything in our environment, and we have to be careful of that because we know that competition isn't necessarily the most wonderful thing. It can promote those ego goals, those outcome focused goal orientations, and that collaboration, surprisingly, is not necessarily as natural as what we see there. But the other thing to remember is that competition is not necessarily bad or good, it's neutral. A lot of whether it's good or bad is how we handle it and the outcomes from it. And so that's important to realize that the social environment has a humongous influence here. And the best example that I have for you here is hockey. There's been research done in hockey that initially said, well, we expect hockey players, since they fight on the ice a lot, will go out in the community and will be more likely to be arrested for deviant behavior such as fighting and aggression. Well, in fact, that's not true. That hypothesis was not proven. Hockey players and athletes in general, despite what you see on TV and the publicizing of their transgressions that we see, they are no more likely to have deviant aggressive behavior than you or I. It just so happens the media follows them around and it gets picked up a little more. But what hockey players in particular do is it's socially okay to beat the crud out of somebody on the ice. Sometimes that's even a hockey player's job. But they know that once they leave the ice, then there's a different set of rules, a different social context, and so then they play nice along with everybody else, which is really interesting, but it also shows that social environment has a humongous influence there. In general, when we think about cooperation and collaboration versus competition, cooperation produces superior performance, which is something that's counterintuitive for a lot of folks. We don't necessarily always agree or want to believe this right away. The kicker is that in a very pure sense, collaboration purely versus competition purely, competition is more likely in that pure sense to promote anxiety and that other referencing that devalues or weakens us psychologically or challenges us psychologically than a collaborative perspective, especially in the face of failure or setbacks. But in a very pure sense, we do see that cooperation as a stronger input. In addition, since that's a very simple view, what we know is that in real life we always have a mix of these, and typically that's what works best. And in fact, our elite performers, no matter what their perspective is, recognize when to view things as competitive and when to view things as collaborative and cooperative. And they switch and vacillate back and forth, and that ultimately provides us with the very best performance. It's enough motivation from a competitive standpoint to have us work hard and do the things we need to do, but it's also not so ego goal-oriented that we go off by ourselves or we promote a lot of anxiety because we have a limited task mastery focus. So please don't think of these as polar opposites, nor should we think that competition is the very best. Typically, cooperation by itself produces superior performance, but competition is, as Triplet's study shows us, it's everywhere in life. We can't necessarily get away from it. Moving forward, there's attributes that are related to both, and so hopefully when we're working with athletes and exercisers and we're trying to generate both ego and or probably decrease an ego motivation and increase a task mastery motivation, we're going to be looking at promoting a number of things. And typically we spend time decreasing our ego motivation. It's not something we oftentimes do a lot of structuring to increase. So please take a look at how to balance these cooperative competitive efforts, knowing that these are our best guidelines for performance. An important situation to think about and keep in mind is when we have really fierce rivalries, such as you see between the Bears and the Packers. The reason I bring this up, not necessarily just because I'm a little bit of a Packers fan, and we have a bunch of Bears fans in class, but and a couple Packer fans, um, but because it is considered the fiercest rivalry, certainly in football, if not in sports altogether. But they, despite this fierce rivalry, can be extremely collaborative and cooperative. And the example of that is during October, when they have both teams wear the same color in support of breast cancer awareness. And so what you'll see during the month of October is both Packer players and Bears players wearing pink in support of what we call a supraordinate goal, a goal higher than their football competition that both groups can get behind. And so competition and collaboration, while they're important, when you have this fierce rivalry, sometimes you have to defuse that. And one of the ways to defuse that is to take this superordinate goal, something that's meaningful to everyone and is quote unquote of a higher order than the NFL, and have them get behind it. And so then what you'll see during October is you'll see all the players in the NFL and on these two teams, even when they play each other, wearing pink in that cooperative effort. And so there's a way to see that superordinate piece that I'd like you to pay attention to. That kind of wraps up this section. Let's move on into our feedback and reinforcement section. This is, again, got a study guide slide to help us understand some of that. Let's make sure we understand that reinforcement, again, these are the fundamental principles of behavior modification. Reinforcement is a reward. It can be of any kind or any sort you can imagine, from food to money to access to power and those kinds of things. And typically a reward is a good consequence of an action, but you can have negative reinforcement as well. So when you use the classic bad dog example, dog does something bad, you flip it on the nose, or people hit them with newspapers, or worse than that, hopefully not. But the idea is that positive reinforcement as a reward leads us to want to do that again and get the reward, that little hot dog treat for the dog. Negative reinforcement inhibits us from doing that behavior again. So the idea is either have someone or something repeat the behavior versus not repeat the behavior. You can see here we have these are kind of difficult concepts to go through, because all the individual differences and things that we talk about with individuals, everybody reacts a little differently to the situation. Some people, if you think about that really, really bad kid you had in class in elementary school, sometimes these individuals act out just because they need some attention, and even negative attention is better than no attention. And so negative reinforcement sometimes can be a reinforcer, a positive reinforcement, because at least even though you're yelling at me and sending me to detention, at least someone's paying attention to me. And you think of it, maybe at home this individual has very little attention or gets very little attention otherwise. Reinforcement's also really difficult because we can't always reproduce that exact behavior that's desired. So think a basketball shooter who is trying to make a shot or a layup, and their hand position or elbow position's off. In the heat of the moment, sometimes it's hard to repeat that. And then based upon the situation, we all get different reinforcers. And so individually, it's reinforcement is a challenging proposition. There's really two ways to go about it. One's the positive approach, which is what we call catch them being good. There's even a book, if you're interested, reading about, I think it's youth sports and raising children, called Catch Them Being Good. I recommend it. And it's strictly focused on this idea of when someone does something you want them to do, you reward that behavior. When they do something you don't want them to do, you ignore it. And so they get zero attention, the idea being that attention, especially positive attention, is the reward that children and athletes are looking for. The negative approach we talked a little bit about previously is this bad dog idea. If you've ever trained a dog, you have admonishments and you have body postures and you have tone of voice that reward or punish your dog for those behaviors. One of the classic examples of dog training we see is trying to potty train a dog to go outside, and if someone comes home and the dog has wet on the floor, then sometimes people have been taught, oh, we just rub their nose in it, so they learn that that's a bad thing. Really, if it depends on when that happened. We'll talk more about that in a second, but that's an example of a negative approach. Bad dog rubbed their nose in the urine. As gross as it sounds, we'll talk about what that means here in a second. Ideally, we should combine both a positive and a negative approach to our activities. The idea that we should reward positive behavior, we should negatively reinforce inappropriate or undesirable behavior, but also ignore some undesirable behavior so the people aren't being rewarded just for getting attention themselves. I put a note up here about a 2-minute tip drill a team I worked with did, and that's where they run the width of a basketball court with their arms over their heads, bouncing the ball off of the backboard. Really not a tough drill to do with 15 people, but you have to do it continuously for 2 minutes. So, it's a challenge on their arms, and initially it's a skill as well as a hustle drill and those kinds of things. And it's also a team building skill. But then when the coach gets angry because they're not able to continuously do it and they keep starting over their 2 minutes, then they start pulling people out. So what started as a drill for 15 people becomes a drill with 14, and then 13, and then 12. Then it starts to be a lot more of a negative approach than is a positive approach in having them do that. Ideally, when we work with physical activity and sport, we want to use about an 80% positive approach and typically no more than 20% of the negative approach. And the reason is that negative approach, A, can be a reinforcer itself, like we talked about, or it can instill fear, and that's not necessarily a very desirable thing. How many of you who are listening to this and watching these had to take a run for a penalty for bad behavior or something in high school or middle school, or even if you played in college? It's pretty common that we use physical activity as a punishment. And my question, hopefully across the course of the semester, is should physical activity be a punishment, or should it be a luxury? Should it be a desirable behavior? And if we promote physical activity as a desirable behavior, maybe lifelong physical activity will start to have a different approach than it does currently. I'll give you an example of this. We did a research study at a YMCA day camp a few years back. And unbeknownst to us, the campers had to pick up all their trash after lunch. They were outside in the sun with no air conditioning under a tent. And for every piece of trash they had on the ground that after lunch that they didn't pick up or missed, then they lost 1 minute of free play. And the end of the day was set aside for about 2 to 3 hours of free play. They could do anything they want. And so we happened to show up one day, and here they were, 90 plus degrees, even though they were in a tent, they didn't have any AC, and these 6 to 14-year-olds, about 50 of them, had to sit still quietly for, I think, 6 or 8 minutes that day because the instructors had found 6 to 8 pieces of trash on the ground. And so the whole group lost 6 to 8 minutes of physical activity, of free play time at the end of the day. Now, imagine for yourself, what do you think happened when they blew the whistle and said, okay, penalty time is up, free play's on? Do you think the kids walked calmly and quietly over to the fence and just kind of hung out and did nothing? I hope not, because I can tell you that when they blew that whistle, the kids ran around like a bunch of uncaged wild animals and literally took up the last 2 hours and, 45 minutes, or whatever it was, of their free play time being super physically active. Especially they were super physically active there at the start of the few minutes when they'd been released. And so here, those, unbeknownst to us, as we happened to be just doing a study of something different, we found these YMCA camp counselors were actually doing it perfectly. They were using physical activity as a reward for good behavior. And bad behavior resulted in physical activity being taken away. And I thought that was a wonderful, wonderful thing to see, and I wonder how we can incorporate that lifelong into different activities, especially, high school. I had that stereotypical high school experience as well. The reinforcement principles are those factors and means of reinforcing things that, much like we showed you on the first slide in this session, that can act as positive reinforcers or rewards for us. one of the most important things about reinforcing, just like the target activity, is the schedule in which we do it. And I mentioned previously that potty training a dog example. The reason why we don't recommend from a training the dog perspective to rub the dog's nose in it is the timing piece here. If, say, for example, you go out to the grocery and you're gone for 2 hours, when you come back, the dog is wet on the floor. Now, did you set the dog up for success? That's slightly a different question, but I want you to think about that. The second thing is, when you leave, when is the dog wet on the floor? Did the dog wet on the floor right when you came home because they're so excited to see you and they've been lonely? Or right after you left, did the dog wet on the floor? Or 30 minutes after you left, or 45 minutes, or an hour and a half after you left? When did the dog wet on the floor? And then the other thing to keep in mind is the brain that you're dealing with a dog. Their short-term memory is so short, and the number of things they can hold in their short-term memory is much smaller than ours. And they have to have a connectedness in the timing of these activities. So here's the challenge with rubbing the dog's nose in their urine when you're trying to teach them to potty train. If you come back after 2 hours and you rub their nose in it, if they peed right after you left because maybe they were sad that their buddy was leaving, then when you rub their nose in it, you're just being mean to the dog, and the dog's like, why is he rubbing my nose in this? This doesn't smell good. If the dog went to the bathroom when he heard the door or she heard the door open and is excited to see you and then just, went, what you're doing, from a proximity standpoint, stimulus response, you're basically reinforcing to the dog, don't be excited that I came home. So that's not necessarily the best solution. Rather, what we want to do is we want to catch them being bad and connect that stimulus of being bad with that negative reinforcer if we're choosing to do that. Much like catch them being good, when we catch them being bad, we have to catch them at that moment, because especially with a dog, we can't cognitively connect being bad with the time lapse between stimulus and response. I'll give you a personal example. I have a American Water Spaniel, which I think you'll see here in a few minutes, named Bailey. She's a wonderful dog, and when I was potty training her, I was very sensitive to the timing schedule issue. And so as we're almost done with potty training, I saw her come into the living room and circle up a couple times and lift her leg and start to go to the bathroom. And so I jumped out of the couch, grabbed her by the collar, and pulled her over to the patio door, and I won't say threw her outside, but pulled her outside so she could finish going to the bathroom. What was I left with? Well, I was left with a really interesting scenario. I had this stream of dog urine going through the house, as unpleasant as it sounds, but then she finished up outside. But that shows you an example of stimulus response. As soon as she started going to the bathroom, I took her outside. Now, I was a little late. I should have predicted and paid more attention to her. So when I saw her start to circle in the house, then I knew, it was time to go. But the good news is, from about that moment on, Bailey knew then to go outside when it was time to go to the bathroom. And so we developed a system from that, where now she actually goes to the door, rings a bell, that means I want to go outside, and we let her out, and she does her business and comes back in. But it was that, I hate to say dragging point, that was the stimulus response. So that's an example of the timing piece so that she can learn and be successful. In addition to our timing schedule is the idea that we need an intermittent response. And this is probably something you're doing if you have a pet now. And initially when you teach a drill, you reward them every time they do it correctly or when they do a piece of it correctly. But then over time, periodically, once they've learned that drill, you reward them on an intermittent schedule. So they really never know whether they're getting a treat. They just expect it, hopefully. And maybe they're not rewarded, but they'll do it again next time, hoping that a treat comes. And that's our timing schedule. And so we want to reward that appropriate behavior. That's a positive reinforcement technique. So you can see pictures of my lovely Bailey here. She's relaxing there and making sure that we break our shaping of behavior into pieces and have that timing of stimulus and response close together. Those are important pieces. Really, when we talk about feedback, it's about feeding our athletes, feeding our exercisers, making sure that we give them the correct motivation and instruction that we feed them sincerely. Don't give somebody false praise because they're going to see through that, I promise you. Make sure you praise everything. Praise them physically, praise them verbally, show them a facial expression. There's an old adage or story about Pat Summitt, who was the former women's basketball coach at the University of Tennessee. And if you're interested in a little outside activity, go to YouTube and look up Pat Summitt's scowl. Her scowl is notoriously a negative reinforcer that some of her athletes saw. So we need to think about feeding student athletes as well as exercisers. What not to do. I'm an Indiana alum. I graduated with my bachelor's from Indiana University and was there during the Bobby Knight tenure, and so I kind of can say that I lived through, although I didn't play for him or I didn't really know Coach Knight, but he's a classic example of negative reinforcement. And in a very simple sense, a lot of his behaviors are things that hopefully we're not doing with our exercises or with our athletes at the present time. We're not focusing on criticism. We're not providing criticism with sarcasm. We're not using physical abuse. We're not using guilt. So we're using just strictly positive reinforcement. And again, negative reinforcement is acceptable in a very limited sense, maybe 10 to 20% tops. When I think negative reinforcement, we're talking about punishment. But it can generate some fear and some anxiety. And when it's done on that intermittent schedule or it's done very personally, it can be very painful and very detrimental. So make sure you understand that you should do it minimally, that it's unpleasant and can create that fear. And what we want to do is we want to actually generate a positive motivation. Punishment guidelines here, again, make sure it's consistent, it's valuable, it's honest, it's impersonal, meaning it's done, we're punishing, you missed the free throw, I'm not punishing Bob or Judy. Judy missed the free throws. We're punishing the lack of free throws. Having athletes provide input, have exercisers provide input is hugely important so they know what's coming and they buy into that. Probably should not be showing you slides of my children within the dog crates, but I promise that this is not how we do true punishment in my house. The children, this is shortly after we got our Bailey, the children crawled into the dog crates on their own. They thought it was a funny little game. But yeah, hopefully you don't punish children or exercisers or athletes this way. And make sure that you punish them afterwards and try and modify that behavior, because in the moment, in the event, it's not necessarily very helpful because there's so much else going on. And so we think of behavior modification from a quiz question standpoint is contingency management. How do we handle contingencies? Well, we learn, we teach people how to handle them. We coach people on their behavior. So when you're really hungry, maybe we try and teach our exercisers to have a glass of water versus a peanut butter parfait. Or we teach people to modify their behavior. So when you're hungry, instead of that peanut butter parfait, we go for a piece of fruit and maybe with a little bit of honey on it. So we're modifying it versus completely changing that. So again, make sure that you apply these things to your target activity. There's a number of ways that we can improve these, but documenting them and having the athlete buy in and include in those things is hugely important. As we move forward talking about from feedback and motivation, it's important for us to recognize that there's a special type of motivation called intrinsic motivation, and that we want to generate and stimulate intrinsic motivation in our exercises and our athletes and our children and our bosses and our employees. We want to generate this in everyone. And the important thing behind intrinsic motivation is we have this inner strive to succeed, to excel, to perform, to be competent, what we call self-determination, in their quest to master that task, whether it's running a triathlon or it's walking every day or getting up early to do yoga. We want them to have that intrinsic motivation. And you can see from what we call the self-determination theory, that intrinsic motivation exists along a continuum going from the left of amotivation all the way out to being intrinsically motivated on the right. And then in the middle, we have what's called extrinsic motivation, where we're motivated to do things by rewards and other types of feedback, not internally. We don't just have that drive, that want to do it. And what you see is, as we move to the left, we become more self-determined. In other words, we have that intrinsic motivation. So someone who has to get up every morning and coach makes them come to practice, was going to be very externally regulated, very much on the left side of extrinsic motivation. But then after they do that for a few times, pretty soon they identify themselves as a basketball player. They integrate getting up every day for early practice, or just going to early bird PE, or just getting up early and doing some studying. They've integrated that into their lives, but it's still because coaches, kind of chirping in their ear, or the specter of coaches looming over them. However, at some point, they start recognizing getting up early allows them to study more, allows them to do their own exercise program, allows them to get to class on time, or things like that as they move through college. And they become what I think of as an intrinsically motivated early riser. They have that stimulus, they recognize the accomplishment, they get that knowledge that getting up early is beneficial to them and it's valuable. And so they get up early. They're intrinsically motivated to arise early, but they started out really over on the, as a typical teenager, very externally regulated to get up early, and coaches' reward system help them develop that. There's a number of factors that influence our intrinsic motivation, both social, in the surrounding context, as well as those that we have within us. It's very important for us to think about that and know those factors, but it's also important for us to understand that, believe it or not, rewards, say money, fame, accolades, food, can actually undermine intrinsic motivation. So if you show up to class every time and I start giving you $1, pretty soon you're going to stop showing up to class on time, because, believe it or not, my dollar will have decreased your motivation to be there. Now, that may seem like a fallacy, but here's the kicker. Being paid for working on something that's really valuable to you suddenly changes the value of that activity. And this is what we often think we see when we see athletes go from a college to a professional rank. Suddenly they're making great money for something they love, for the nature of the game, and their motivation to be their popular best versus just meet the terms of their contract changes. And it comes down to that perception. Do you perceive that reward, that money, that fame, that food, whatever it is, as controlling? In other words, if you drop this ball less than 10 times, I'll give you an extra $10,000. Or for every time you drop the ball, I'll give you, or don't drop the ball, I'll give you an extra $500. Is that very controlling, or is it simply motivational and informational? That, oh, I dropped a ball, we want you to drop the ball less than 25 times through the season, we'll give you some money. Okay, that's very informational versus that controlling one of every time you drop it. We have money associated with that. So this perception helps with our intrinsic motivation by showing us that how we perceive our feedback as controlling versus informational is hugely important. And so you need to think about different examples of feedback. The bonus programs that we have at our employers, the comments that people say to us, that our friends or family say or do, or how clothes fit differently as an exerciser, or the aches and pains that come in after exercise. Are those controlling or informational aspects? Also think about punishment in terms of a foul, say, in competition. If you think about a personal foul in basketball, is that controlling or is that informational? There are different aspects to that. And then let me say this again, controlling informational aspects of, say, a penalty for fighting in hockey. Those two examples, controlling information versus a basketball foul and a hockey penalty, are very important things to think about, because both those situations have controlling and informational aspects. Here's an intro sort of to our target activity. I'd like you to pause the screencast here and go read and get started on that. But I'm going to just do a quick comment, that idea that these climates, much like the YMCA day camp, where we want to be physically active, where we start doing physical activity, we can't stop it, is what we call a mastery or a mastery-oriented climate, a very highly motivational climate. And those are the climates we want to generate. And we can create a climate by manipulating 6 parts of that climate. Okay, and those 6 parts are tasks, authority, rewards, groupings, evaluations, and timings. And so for your target activity, you're going to talk about how you modify or manipulate in a given environment, such as, say, a basketball team who needs to improve their worst free throw shooters percentage, or in a fitness center that needs to improve the number of participants in say a spin class, or in a rehabilitation setting where you have someone who's not coming in for their rehab like they should, or you have someone as a personal trainer who's not doing their physical activity that you'd like them to do. How can you manipulate that environment, or these 6 aspects of the environment that just happen to spell target, T-A-R-G-E-T, and get them to hopefully come in more often and be more enthusiastic when they are there. This target activity is actually due at the end of week 3, but I figured that it would be a good idea to talk about it now and direct you to look at the assignment on Western Online in week 3, just because we're covering the material now, and it takes some time to process how to develop this type of climate. So if you have questions, please contact me ASAP, but again, this target activity is due at the end of week 3, and it's posted under the week 3 materials. A special case of intrinsic motivation is something we call flow, or oftentimes called the zone. Quickly think back across your life, whether it's work or play or exercise or sports or any other thing, and remember whether you've ever had a moment where you felt like you were in the zone, where time kind of merged or stopped together and you lost that sense of place, but yet you performed essentially flawlessly, without effort, and it was just a very, very special, very empowering and positive experience. That's typically what we think of as flow. So the important thing to remember about flow is it's a special case of intrinsic motivation where you're participating essentially, not just essentially, but because you want to be there, and there is a perceived lack of effort and time. So in addition to being this special case of intrinsic motivation, flow is special because it is so enjoyable that people often want to return to that setting and situation, and it's very challenging to do so. So typically flow occurs and is experienced with this balance of effort and challenge and skills. You're totally absorbed, you've got clear goals, you have merging of action. Awareness is the one, that loss of time, space, sort of continuum. That transformation is something we see pretty often. Important part of flow is understanding the quadrant and the quadrant that flow is in, because that helps you understand when we can be in flow. And then granted, this is 2 continuums set up perpendicular against one another. But I want you to think about Wittgenstein's example, because it helps us realize that flow in the upper right corner occurs when there's a match or a very close alignment between challenge and skill. So the activity that we're doing, or the exercise, or the sport, whatever it is closely aligned with our skill level. Flow cannot and does not occur when the challenge is too high or too easy for us, or our skills are too high or too low for the for the challenge that we're faced. And in fact, you can see in the other 3 quarters of the quadrant model that when our challenge is really high and our skill level is perceived to be really low, that's where we have angst and anxiety. And this is frankly where you're going to see a lot of new exercisers, and sometimes you'll see even competitive athletes enter into this anxiety phase because of perception that their skills are low and the challenge is high. You'll notice that when the challenge is low and our skills are low, we have apathy. We don't care. And so here's a situation with a new exerciser. They may be apathetic and not really care about exercising. And then it's about showing them, the challenge is real and the challenge matches where their skill level is. You can actually meet them where they're at and hopefully nurture them towards flow, because flow is not just about elite performers. And you see in the third category where the challenge is low but our skill level is high, as we get bored. And that doesn't mean that only in that fourth area, but when there's a significant mismatch, then we tend to have a little more boredom. So flow is typically going to occur in that upper right quadrant. Important quiz question and understanding is that flow in and of itself is an uncontrollable. We can't guarantee that you're going to be there, but what we can do is increase the likelihood that you can achieve flow. We just can't control and guarantee that you're going to be in there, or after a certain phase or after a certain amount of time you're going to achieve flow. So you need to understand it as this uncontrollable phenomena that is in my brief experiences with flow, it's the best drug in the world. It is, I would love to go back to those couple flow moments I've had and been in the zone, because they were just so wonderful. And I think that sort of addictive, enjoyable quality is what makes us want to keep working towards that, and shows us its intrinsic motivation. So to set us up to get into flow, we have to be motivated. We have to have an optimal level of arousal, going back to our very first unit, and that optimal level based on the skill and who we are and what our experience is. We have to have what's called a present moment focus. In the moment, not worried about last week's game or last week's exercise workout or the consequences of this game or what happens at the meeting this afternoon. We have to be focused in the moment. Plans and routines where things become automatic help us nurture that flow experience. And so that's why we automatize and try to have athletes have pre-participation routines. We try to develop these in our exercisers so they're not forgetting their equipment or those kinds of things, and they're more likely to achieve flow. Preparation is hugely important. Again, we go back to that routine piece and having the confidence. We talked about the other three quadrants. If you don't have confidence, then your perceived skill level will be very, very low, and the challenge has to meet that. It may be easier actually to improve your confidence and keep that challenge very low so that we can help people potentially achieve that flow. Positive play and shared purposes are very important. The arousal is a huge piece here, because ultimately the image you're looking at is a woman who is right side up. She's supposed to be skis up, head down in a freestyle aerial skiing, and she's going to land on ice in about 20 feet straight down. But she's going to come out of that, and it's important for her to do that. But not everybody does. Crashes are very common in the sport, so a part of being in flow or being able to achieve flow is being so automatic with whatever your activity is that you can handle challenges such as weather or delays due to others' injuries and those kinds of things, and that you can handle and know what to expect. I personally, wouldn't be the one to go flipping upside down, but she loved it. That was for her, so clearly she's more able to enter flow there. Impeding flow is actually really pretty easy. Just obstruct or deconstruct any of the things we just talked about. And I really use a lot of examples of damming here, because I think of flow as a stream or a river that you want to keep flowing. And anything that slows down the stream or backs it up, like a pond or a beaver dam, ultimately is impeding flow. So that preparation is an issue. Environmental issues, team conflict are issues. Confidence we've talked about are going to impede us with flow. Inappropriate focus or pre-competition preparation are huge, and lacking, just the motivation, just don't really care, are fantastic impediments to flow. So we want to try and avoid those at all costs. Arousal level, again, we go back to our freestyle aerialist. She has to be ready to be aroused, and she has to understand she's going to be upside down. If that surprises her, then certainly she's not going to be in flow, and even worse things can happen. Here, this last one is where I admit to a guilty pleasure, and that's to watch sport teams, what I call implode. When you start seeing bickering on the court or out on the field or those kinds of things, or even if you in the gym, if you're observing and watching personal trainers not get along with their clients and those kinds of things, I admit that I personally enjoy watching that happen. It's a classic example of when flow is not going to happen. Um, but it's interesting, I think, for the psychologist in me, for the simple fact that um, here's this, all this time you've spent together, and here's your moment to shine, and then instead we're going to bicker, and all these other things are going to get in the way. And so, again, it's a guilty pleasure. I hate to see people suffer, and I don't necessarily get excited by their misery. Yet at the same time, it's a great example of the material that we're talking about here in class. So that arguing and that deconstruction of our teams is an important piece. Flow is a great situation, a great special example of intrinsic motivation. And again, it's not controllable, but you can increase your odds of getting there, much like going to Las Vegas is, you can increase your odds of coming home from Las Vegas if as soon as you win, you walk away from the tables and get on the plane and fly home. But ultimately, the odds are uncontrollable, and they're not really stacked in your favor in Las Vegas, much like they're not stacked in our favor in life, and so we have to keep battling. So communication is the last section that we're going to talk about, and then again we've started with session outline, so you have those study guide questions. Communication is an interesting interesting topic. Believe it or not, we're not going to spend a ton of time on it because unfortunately most of it I believe is common sense, but we just don't do it. So it does merit time in the class. It does merit you reading, but it doesn't merit a lot of slides because most of the time, if we follow that golden rule of do unto others how you would have others do unto you, we will do fine with our communication. But we oftentimes lose these, certainly in today's day and age with technology and texting and email and social media and those kinds of things. Communication's a little different, and so we'll talk about sometimes how that can get lost in translation. Communication takes a number of forms and has a specific number of purposes. Ideally, we communicate for really important reasons. We want to persuade. Oh, Dr. Cole, I need to persuade you to give me more points or to open that deadline back up so I can submit something. Or we want to evaluate, Dr. Cole, we evaluated your teaching, and this is what we came up with, and this is what we saw was good and bad, and those kinds of things. Information, much like this, as well as the other materials we have, we're communicating information about the content of the class. Certainly in sport and exercise, we're interested in motivating individuals and in encouraging them to perform at their very best level. And then also there's an interactive piece of communication that's identified specifically towards problem solving. But when we think about communication, and certainly with email and digital technologies, we lose some of these. We need to really think about three types of communication. There's the interpersonal, which is between people, between you and myself, or between students in the class, essentially between individuals. There's nonverbal communication, a smile, a shrug, the middle finger are all examples of nonverbal communication. A little crass, but typically we all learn very quickly what those types of nonverbal communication mean. And then there's the intrapersonal communication, which is the conversation that we have with ourselves, whether it's self-talk or it's that ongoing dialogue. Sometimes it takes the form of sort of a YouTube video going through our head and the successes or failures that we've had in the past. But those are our three primary types of communication that we engage in. And the important part of them is that not only do we decide to communicate, we decide what kind of message we want to send, we decide how we want to convey it, and then we do our very best to convey it in an accurate way. And certainly when you're getting to know someone new, conveying messages certainly is difficult, and that's an important part of the communication process, is understanding how people communicate and how people receive messages, and that reception sometimes is a point of contention. Either it's misinterpreted or it's miscommunicated, and that's where challenges across all levels really start. When we think about strategies for doing effective communication as an instructor, I've had a number of great experiences, certainly as an athletic trainer and working in sports psychology. I've had a number of great experiences with communication as a parent and as a spouse. Communication has played an important role here. So there's some very valuable do's and don'ts. And really effective communication, it will give you these strategies for improving our communication. I want you to think about the last time you lobbied for a grade change, or lobbied for more points, or asked somebody out at the bars, or did something at work and provided information, those things. And think about that communication style and see how many of these strategies you employed and which of these strategies perhaps you shut down. Because ultimately, the strategies are supremely important in having good communication. And certainly, when we have communication problems, which I think 90% of the time in sport that there have been challenges, it's been communication. It's a failure to not utilize or to inaccurately utilize one of these strategies. We also have some strategies here for sending effective messages, as well as being receptive from an active listening standpoint. And these are really these are things hopefully our parents or guardians taught us when we were young children, but they're things we lose when we do more texting and emailing rather than face-to-face communication. These are also things that we lose when we do, 24 character tweets versus, a long essay that has to be written. So these message sending to and receiving messages effectively are important things that we need to keep in mind. And remember about being consistent with both our verbal and our nonverbal behaviors, because if I say good job and I give you the scowl, then it comes across as sarcastic. Whereas if I say good job and I'm smiling, I pat you on the back, it comes across as sincere and accurate. So reception and sending of messages needs to be parallel with all parts of our bodies. Remember, when we're listening, restating, paraphrasing back, not parroting, but paraphrasing back what someone has said, and you typically with starting with what I hear you saying is that I returned my assignment in too late, so I can't get all the points. Well, I disagree with this because those are the kinds of things, strategies for good active listening that we need to have. And they bring to mind this idea of confrontation. Confrontation is a good thing. Certainly it doesn't look pretty, and a lot of people are afraid of confrontation, but confrontation is just another form of communication that involves both information and persuasion, and perhaps problem solving. And that's really all a confrontation is. Now, for some reason, we as humans do confrontation poorly, or we get out of the habit of doing confrontation. I think the only people who really do confrontation well are lawyers, unfortunately. But there's some things about confrontation that we want to keep in mind, and we're going to talk about. We're going to have some activities here across the course of the semester that are going to help with this. Key number one with sport and exercise: don't confront when you're angry. Classic example is a parent who's unhappy with what's happening out on the field and sends a text message to the coach during the game. Or better yet, that parent who marches out of the stands at the end of the game and confronts the coach on the sideline as they're walking in. No one's in the mood to have a confrontation at that point, and it's really an inappropriate time, although we do see lots of that happening. The keys to confrontation are being in control, being constructive, being able to identify and see both sides of the issue, even if you disagree with that other side, and being able to convey that. And if you can't do those 4 points, then you're not ready to have the confrontation yet. Or certainly you're not going to have a good confrontation as it goes. So there's some specific do's and don'ts when it comes to confronting and providing constructive criticism, which is actually really good and helps us get better. But one of the challenges there is not being open to the solution. You may very well know the solution. However, I discourage you from communicating that solution. Rather, the two of you should come to the solution together. And sometimes it's helpful to kind of suggest different ideas with maybe the most viable solution buried in there, and work with that person to help them find that most viable solution. You never know, maybe another one will come up. The talk to the hand methodology of stopping communication, or the silent treatment, doesn't work. It may make you feel better briefly, but all it does is prolong the confrontation, so it's not going to help us. We'll talk more when we do self-efficacy about put-downs and nonverbal hints to communicate thoughts, but and again, too much information about my marriage, but this is a classic example of, well, I thought you knew. What I meant was, I hear that from my wife. It's like, I wasn't paying attention to her. I wasn't looking at her when she was talking to me because there was body language, or there was a hint in there somewhere, and I don't see that. And when you're in a long-term relationship with someone or you know someone really well, it's easy to blur these lines. You get good at reading nonverbal behavior, but then sometimes you fall out of practice or you mistake while you're learning through there. So don't rely on nonverbal hints or behaviors or signals or signs to communicate your message. Keys and things to go through, and I see this sometimes with students who are unhappy with grades, is I receive a page or two written of a rant, essentially flaming me via email about how unhappy the student is about a grading and how they think it's unfair. And 99 times out of 100, my response to the student is, I understand you have a concern. Why don't you set up a time to come talk to me? Because doing it via email is incorrect and inappropriate, and all the communication skills that we have don't happen via email. We can't read nonverbal behavior and body language via email. So it's much more professional and much more constructive to do it in person. Then I ask students to read those emails and talk to me about what their actions and events are that concern them and explain their position. And then ask them, to explain when, just saying I don't think it's fair isn't enough. You can cite fairness all you want, but confrontations need to back up that fairness with why it's unfair compared to another person's position or another time or another instance. And then ask, constructively, what I'd like to see done is X, Y, or Z. Those are constructive steps, but that one-page flame where you feel better as soon as you hit send, sometimes is accompanied with buyer's remorse. And after you hit send, you're like, oh, I probably shouldn't have sent that. So we have to be careful of that in the digital age, because as soon as you send or hit send, then your supervisor, your coworker, your coach, your what have you, your significant other has it. It's out there. And unfortunately, that stuff doesn't go away. So it's even more important, I think, in this digital age to use good habits of communication and constructive criticism.
That's all, folks.